Welcome to Positive Recovery MD. If you're listening, chances are you want to create happiness around you and thrive in your life. We're glad you're here and you've come to the right place. This podcast will inspire and motivate you to not merely survive your recovery journey, we'll give you the tools to build or strengthen your foundation to thrive and flourish in your life. Each week, we'll come together as a community to have authentic conversations around addiction, recovery, and what matters. Growth and progress, not perfection. All while developing positive habits for you to utilize in your life. To learn more, please visit positiverecoverymd.com to sign up to receive the daily positive interventions that we'll review, as well as gain access to exclusive Positive Recovery content available only to Positive Recovery MD listeners. All right, let's get started.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another installment of Positive Recovery MD podcast with your host, Jason Powers and
Julie DeNalfa.
And you guys are in for a treat. We've got Sam and Kim Buser, but he doesn't have the Clancy at the end. You do.
Yeah.
A daughter and father who have a Leaving the Valley podcast. I'll let Julie do the intro. She's so much better than me.
Well, welcome, Dr. Buser. Dr. Buser is the senior staff psychologist for one of the nation's largest fire departments. And he's also an Army veteran who was a tank commander and an intelligence officer with top secret clearance. So we're wondering if we can get the skinny on some cool stuff. He's also was the past president of both the Houston and the Texas Psychological Associations. And he has led therapy retreats in the wilderness where he has combined therapy and outdoor experiences. So those are three cool things about Dr. Buser that I wanted to make sure that our listeners got to hear. And Kimmy is the co-host and show creator for the podcast Leaving the Valley, which really focuses on what you should know about suicide. She is an accomplished actor, writer, producer, and activist with a particular passion for voiceover. So I know Dr. Powers is going to get you to do some type of voiceover with us today. I also understand that she is awaiting the arrival of her baby. She's 8 months pregnant. So we're super excited for you for that. I'm sure Dad is as well. Some cool, super cool things. Dr. Powers was just stoked when he read your 3 unique things. She has walked a 500-mile pilgrimage from the south of France to the western edge of Spain by herself. It's called the Camino de Santiago. And she taught English inside a copper mine in Chile in the highest, driest desert in the world. And she lived alone in South America for an entire year. And she's an actor, like I said, with a particular passion for voiceovers. She has voiced dozens of commercials for TV and radio, as well as various animated and interactive media. So welcome to our podcast. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Powers.
Sure. So why don't you guys tell me about how you met?
How did we meet?
Well, she was born at an early age, I'll tell you that. So
Pretty good.
We met in a hospital, actually.
No, so you guys have this podcast, very unique. The main subject is suicide. Just because some of our viewers are going to be interested and they're going to listen to your podcast. And I'm sure that maybe I think it was the first one I listened to that you kind of went into why you did it. Since our listeners haven't done the research, tell us, why did you start this?
Kimmy, that's a good thing for you to explain.
Sure. So we do mention this on our show. What happened really provoked the whole podcast is a friend of mine posted on social media a very explicit, I'm going to take my life kind of post on Facebook. And it was it's shocking to read that. Although it wasn't really shocking that this person was struggling. She'd been very open and vocal about how hard things were for her. And then there was this post. Unlike almost everyone else who was responding on Facebook, I happened to have a suicide prevention expert in my corner. So I talked to my dad and I said, well, what should I say about this? And how do I respond? And one of the interesting things to me in that interaction was, I grew up in a house. My dad's a psychologist. I grew up in a house where we actively talked about mental health on a regular basis and the importance of communication and expressing your feelings. And even I didn't know how to talk about suicide. And so that began a series of conversations between my dad and I. And we ultimately decided that we should record some of these conversations so that other people could listen and benefit from his wisdom.
That's great. And so you actually take care of, I think one of my, no, not I think, and not one of, but the favorite profession. Whereas, some people will like die. I'll die for my kids, but I just don't think I have it in me to run into a burning building to take care of strangers as much as I would love to be that good of a saint. I just don't know. I don't know. And bless you for what you do. That's a population that deserves, I think, more resources than we give them. Is, especially like the first responders for 9/11. And I've seen some of the John, what's his name, that he had the Late Show where he
Jon Stewart.
Yeah, he was testifying for Congress. Like they need more resources. So, Doc, what do you find is one of the biggest, I guess, challenges in treating that population as it relates to suicide, but also just in general?
So I'm so glad that you brought this up. It's very interesting work. And I've been doing work with first responders, specifically firefighters, for the last almost 13 years. One of the things that really struck me is really what you were saying, Jason. That was no one really understands how difficult their lives are unless you're in those departments, unless you're one of the first responders, one of the family members. So, I think everyone has a sense that this is a tough job and it's probably dangerous and it's stressful. You have no idea how stressful their lives are. The average firefighter in an urban environment like ours that we work in, they describe it as like combat, except you don't have a weapon. It's pretty close. I've been with them on occasion to some of these scenes, unbelievable death and destruction, and that's their typical day. This is not sitting around the station playing dominoes. These people are going out, every, maybe 30, 40 minutes, they're making response. They never know if it's going to be something that's innocuous and minor, or it's going to be something that their lives will be in peril and they're rescuing somebody who's, has had the worst experience that you could possibly imagine. And frankly, many of them are worse than you could imagine. So just with that caveat in mind. So to answer your question more specifically, the hardest thing is these people are trained to not show emotions. Because if you show a lot of emotion, you cannot respond to a dying child. That's not the time you can do this. So it's like being in an ER situation constantly, or for those of us old enough to remember MASH, it's like you're in a MASH unit. That's what they're like, their experiences. So they're constantly dealing with people in the worst possible scenario, and they're typically people that have no other resources. They are the persons that are the first defenders of life, liberty, and property of all the people in the city. So if there's a bad situation, a suicide that they're encountering, or a person who's been injured in a severe car wreck, a shooting, a stabbing, you name it, that's the person that's first going to be on the scene. So they are taught not to show emotions, and they're sort of groomed to do that in their work, is that they can't do that and go on to the next scene. So what happens is that no one can deal with that much stress without being affected by it. That's not to say they're all become PTSD or something, but they're all affected. So eventually something's going to happen that they need to talk about. And yet they're taught that they can't do that. So that's the biggest challenge.
So is it a challenge to sort of intervene on them in your role? Because I know, for instance, like if you're a policeman and you discharge a firearm, there's like a mandatory counseling. Like, what does it look like in the fire department? And since a lot of our listeners have, a substance use disorder, kind of talk about that piece also with that you see, because with that much stress, there has to be an outlet, right? And if you're trained not to show emotion, or let's just say you're a male who grew up in the United States, or even a female, but men were like, don't feel, don't cry, men don't do that. I know things are getting a little more lax in terms of gender roles. They're not as strict, but there's got to be, if you don't get in touch with your emotions, they're going to rule you, right? And
well, you're spot on, of course. And in the fire department, and of course, every department's a little different. So I'm thinking specifically about our department. But in general, what happens in the fire service is that there is not much in the way of substance abuse other than alcohol. So you don't have very many people that are using drugs, even marijuana. It's pretty rare for me to encounter that in the department. And it's pretty rare for our members to do it. I'm not saying it never happens, but that's definitely an exception. But alcohol is a whole nother matter. The use of alcohol is, I'm not saying it is condoned. That's probably not the right word, but it's certainly seen as
acceptable.
It's culturally acceptable.
Right.
And so that becomes a major way of coping with the extreme stresses they have. So I always like to point out there's no such beer called psychologist brew but there are Fireman's Four, and there are various drinks named after fire stations and fire departments. So I'm thinking, that tells you something right there. So
yes, I know. And so Kimi, one of my favorite movies is The Way, which was written by Emilio Estevez. You're nodding your head.
Yeah.
And it stars his father, Martin Sheen, and it's The Walk. And maybe it was amazing. I want to go on this pilgrimage. So just the fact that you've done that, I want you to talk about that as well. As you're the second, but person that does voiceovers, and that's also rare. But like, what's the name of the church at the end of the Camino de Santiago? And I know it was some saint that washed up there, and it was his like casket, right? It was like St. Peter or St. Paul or somebody.
I believe St. James. Yeah.
You sure wasn't
Santiago? I think that is.
Was it Drew Brees? I knew it was important.
It was a super important basketball player. Actually, no, football player. Yeah. It's a fantastic thing. I hope you do it sometime, Dr. Powers. It's an amazing experience. I did it when I was 27, and it was a life-changing moment of learning my own resilience and what I'm capable of, what I'm not capable of, and kind of accepting those two different things. And I started in the south of France. I walked there's many places you can begin from. You could start in Russia and walk all the way across the European peninsula. And I met someone who did. So they made my 500 miles look puny, but it's an really incredible experience. I'm forever grateful the lessons that I learned on that journey. And it's something I reflect on, being able to make great change in your life by just putting one foot in front of the other. And as they say, this is not an original saying, but the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one single step. And I think actually that has a lot to do with your work in recovery as well. Just keep going, and you can go far if you keep putting one foot in front of the other.
So can you start that Camino de Santiago sort of journey any time of year? Or is it like, okay, it's on June 1st, go?
No, you can start any time of year. I would recommend walking it in the spring to summer because it can be really cold in the winter, although it's very hot in the summer. So that's the flip side. I started, I don't even know, probably sometime in May or June, and I walked till the end of July or August. It was about 6 weeks of walking. You can start anywhere. I started at there's official starts. So I started at one of the more official starting places, but you can start, if I met a guy who lived in France who just walked out of his front door, and that's how he started his walk,
People that live in the villages along the route, they just sort of I know there's hostels and you have to pay, but tell me about the sort of the humanity that you experienced and just kind of how others get treated in different parts of the world.
Yeah. If you start at one of the official starting places, you have the benefit of getting this little pilgrim's passport. It's like a little piece of paper. It's actually on the wall behind me, if you can see in my that white thing. So you get a little passport, so you can stay essentially in churches, and you can stay for almost nothing, like a donation of a couple euro. So that's one way that you do it, and it's great because if you want to see Europe but you don't have any money, you could register as a pilgrim and just walk across the country of Spain for almost nothing. So that's one way to do it. Some people, I didn't have the direct experience of having someone open their home to me while I was there. Although, as I was walking, people would come out of their homes and give me food and things like that as I was walking the trail. You do interact. I mean, you have a very interesting cultural experience as well as somewhat spiritual experience. I'm not, it's a Catholic walk. I'm not Catholic, but you at some point, you're so tired, you definitely start to reflect on God and humanity and what are you doing here? You have people that often show you great kindness, and there's a real community amongst the pilgrims, because you wind up, even if you walk by yourself like I did, you wind up making friends along the route, and you see them various times, throughout the journey. And when you see that person that you met on your first week, again, on the last week, you're like, oh my God, you're here. You're like, you're so excited because you've been through this, huge experience together, separately, but together.
That experience that you're describing, so many things for me when I was listening to you really parallel to what you and your dad have been doing with your podcast, Leaving the Valley, in that you said, I'm walking alone, and then I realized there's other people there. And so, that wasn't exactly what you said, but so that often happens with people who are feeling distraught or suicidal, or that they feel very alone, and they sometimes forget that they actually have people that are there for them. And I think that sort of some people feel like the suicidal thinking or the prevention of suicide is like the responsibility of the individual, but really it's the community has such a responsibility to it or for it. And so I think knowing how to help someone, and like you said, like I had my dad to bounce stuff off of, but so many people don't have Dr. Buser in their living room. And so like how does one give good advice? Like what did dad say to you when you were helping, and then how did it spawned into this podcast? But I heard you describing that story, and it just really resonated. Like, wow, like that's in line with still up to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that has really occurred to me in working on the show with my dad is that we have this view, as you said, Julie, that it's one person's responsibility to stop suicide. And it's that individual who is in the worst place in their life, who's in ultimate crisis. We're like, figure it out. You better figure this whole thing out. And we might care about them and we love them, but we don't know exactly how to help them. We really do as a society reflect that it's that one individual's responsibility to get their stuff in order. What has occurred to me in these conversations that I've had with my dad is like, well, we all sort of have a role to play in this, not to say that I'm individually responsible for someone like Anthony Bourdain's death, but that as a society, when we have this view that it doesn't, I see you're struggling, but I don't want to ask any questions. It's inappropriate for me to get involved in that way. Or I wish you luck, but this is sort of, I wash my hands of the situation. It's like, there's a lot more that can be done in general in terms of providing people at large with better mental health tools so that we might have the benefit of knowing how to communicate our emotions and knowing how to communicate our needs. And there's things that we can do on, from within the family to a huge societal push to just remove stigma and make it easier to talk about one's problems. And that's something that in this conversation that I've had with my dad, it's really been a revelation to me. It's like, well, there's certainly things that we could do as a society at large to prevent fatality, like suicide. The same way we prevent fatality by telling people you should buckle up, you should quit smoking, you should eat a healthy diet. We have these sort of very rudimentary things that every American knows that you should wear your seatbelt. It's like not really a debatable point. And when I get in a car and someone doesn't wear their seatbelt, I'm like, why aren't you wearing your seatbelt? I'll like say that out loud. But in the same exact interaction with a friend of mine who posted online, I'm really thinking about taking my life. I was like, should I say something? Essentially, they weren't wearing their seatbelt, but I didn't feel comfortable saying something about it. And in any other situation, I would have definitely spoken up. There's this interesting silence.
I'm sorry. It leads to certain myths about suicide, like I shouldn't ask people if they're suicidal because it might make them think of suicide. Well, that's putting all the responsibility on them to save themselves. I'm not supposed to ask anybody. That's kind of that myth there. Or the other myth about, if a person's suicidal, there's nothing you can do. They're going to do it no matter what you do. But those things basically put all the responsibility on the person who's in distress to save themselves. It's like a person who's drowning. We say, well, save yourself. Good luck to you. We know you're having a hard time. But we can do much more about that. If there's one thing that we know about suicide from the research is that generally you can prevent it. You're not going to prevent all suicides, but you can prevent most suicides if you simply reach out to that person. So the one thing I always tell people, look, don't wait for that person to call you. You call them. If you know somebody's hurting, reach out to them. Don't wait for them to say, I'm going to kill myself. If they're hurting, they're going through a divorce, they lost their job, they're having a hard time, reach out to them. Don't wait for them to reach out to you. And frankly, I do this all the time. People reach out to me and say, I'm worried about so-and-so. So I'm going to reach out to that person. I'm not going to wait for that person to call me.
I was just going to add one more thing to this. And when I say this statistic, it will be both sad and hopeful. And I hope you can see it as both. So the CDC did a survey in 2018 of every person that the family members that they interviewed. This person had gone on to die by suicide. So the attempt had been successful. But of those families that were interviewed, 90% of the people who went on to end their lives had told someone else that they needed help. But what the thing is that we don't know how to help when the help is needed. So to me, it's like when you hear that, it's like, well, 90% of the people in that who actually did unfortunately die by suicide were looking for that intervention. That's a huge amount of people that can be helped because we know that they're looking for help. It's not like there's this idea sometimes that it gets all bottled up inside. And sometimes it does. Of course, there are examples where that person had not confided in anyone, but 90% of the people who did go on to die by suicide had told someone. And that means that's 90% of the time we could intervene.
Yeah. And that flies in the face of another myth, that if, a lot of people that commit suicide don't talk about it first. I heard that. And kind of what you said, a couple of things resonated with me. One, and you too, Kimmy, tell your older sister I keep getting it wrong. But, I remember being a medical student, learning how to interview somebody. And when it got to suicide, when they first told me, okay, ask whether or not they're suicidal, my heart sank, or I had butterflies in my stomach. I just had this feeling like, no, why would I ask? Why would I put that out there? So definitely. And now of course it's just commonplace. It's just another question and definitely something we know how to respond to in our field. Right. But I do think a lot of people out there had that same experience as me. Like there's a lot of fear, like, maybe your podcast is going to give somebody the idea to commit suicide, but that's also, it's just completely the opposite. And it's just one of these taboo subjects. Thank you for kind of breaking through that. And we need to talk more about it. We need to talk about prevention for it. And during this quarantine, suicides have gone up. Alcohol sales have gone up. Yeah. Domestic violence, a lot of things have gone up. You kind of see that figure on the news and then there's nothing to follow up on. What are we going to do to address it?
Yeah.
That really gets me.
Well, suicide contagion is a real thing. And that's one of the things that we've discussed privately. I don't know if we've actually covered this on air, but it is something you have to be considerate of when you talk about suicide, especially when we like to use the word romance the idea. So, like Romeo and Juliet is a great example of romancing the idea of suicide. It seems so justified in that play. That would be the natural end of the story. And so when you sensationalize suicide, when a high profile celebrity dies by suicide, and then we talk in detail about how they did that, yes, that's where suicide contagion can become a real thing. And there's the World Health Organization has guidelines for how the media should report on suicide. And we take those things very seriously. But I think the flip side of that conversation is that we have tried just simply not talking about suicide since the dawn of time, and our numbers continue to rise. So there is a middle ground where we try very hard, for example, to never to give people ideas about ways that one might end their life, because that's dangerous. Generally discussing mental health, generally discussing, well, how do you ask someone if they're suicidal, which is a real question that I had on the show. That's a little different and falls more into the mental health category of like trying to promote conversation, trying to end stigma that surrounds. That's sort of the approach we embrace.
Awesome. Hey, are you willing to do a little voiceover?
Well, do you mean to do an advertisement? What do you need?
I don't know, like pretend, those of you that are listening that aren't seeing the video, her father, Sam, is got this background where he's sort of in outer space. You can see Earth. So like make up a movie about him on the fly, like just kind of
or like how they do those in a world.
Yes.
In a world where there's one dad, Sam Buser, father to them all.
Thank you.
Yeah, there you go. Oh.
Yeah, that's great. How did you get into voiceover acting? Was it sort of a side effect of like you were doing acting and then it just kind of like, well, okay, let me try this. I'm going to enough auditions. Or was it something you dreamt of when you were, 5?
Oh man. I've always done voiceover. I've just gotten paid to do it for like the last decade or so. But, even as a kid, I would like make up voices for my fork and my spoon and my knife had like assigned roles. I had like a little fable I had made up about them, and I would tell it at the dinner table. I mean, I've been doing this forever. And then I was in a play in Santa Cruz, California. There was a pretty famous voiceover actor in the play. And I was like, oh, I've heard a bunch of different people have told me I should get into voiceover. And he was like, you're a fool if you don't get into voiceover, like with this amazing godlike voice, his awesome sound. So he said I should study with, XYZ in Los Angeles, where I was living at the time. And so when I moved back to LA after the play ended, I called these, places. I started this sort of journey of educating myself on what is voiceover? How do I do it? How do I make any money at it? And sort of took it from there. Yeah.
That's great. I didn't do it with silverware when I was young, but with my youngest, we'll put on like a news channel or somebody talking, and I'll put it on mute. And then I'll just do funny, like a whole funny story about like what jacket they're wearing, or, who's got the worst mustache.
Yeah. Exactly.
Not at all. Nobody's going to pay for that. I can guarantee. And it's not funny unless you're like 11. So,
well, I mean, you have to know your audience. That's the thing.
That's right.
I'm just super thankful for you guys coming on and talking about suicide the way that you do so openly. And it's not like it needs to be normalized. However, it has to be normalized in the conversation, right? So that we can actually ask the right questions and begin to not be afraid to ask the question, and also ask it the right way. I'm a psychiatric nurse by background, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, you don't have a plan though, right? I'm afraid now to tell you that I have a plan because you just told me that I probably shouldn't have a plan. And so I think it's always important to ask the question the right way. I wound up getting into psychiatric nursing because I loved it, but I also had a really close friend of mine commit suicide at a very young age. And that was one of my biggest, kind of learnings before I was even a nurse, was that, well, I wish I would have asked more questions. I asked plenty, so we knew there was stuff going on, and I was able to absolutely connect her with people that could help her. And I was young. I was like 19 at the time. So I don't have regrets about not asking the right questions, but I think a lot of people that I've talked to over the course of the last 30 years absolutely have said, like, I should have asked more. So I think for our listeners that it's okay to ask more. Like, it's okay to dig a little deeper. The person actually really does want to talk. And Dr. Buser, you might add more to that, but I just wanted to share that.
Oh, thank you, Julie. I think one of the things that eludes people is how frequent this happens, how common a cause of death. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. It's the second leading cause of death of young people ages 10 to 34. This is not a rare event. It happens a lot. So there are more people who die every year by suicide. You guys know this, but just for your audience, more people die by suicide every year than die in car wrecks. More people die by suicide than by homicide. So this is not a rare event that you don't know anybody who would ever think of this. You know somebody who will consider suicide. And there's a good chance that you know someone who has taken their life. It happens so frequently. And the other thing that along those lines, what you were saying, Julie, I wanted to come back to, and that is, you do not have to have a psychiatric illness to take your life. I think that's one of the things that people get confused about. They say, well, I know Joe, and he would never take his life or her life because they're not crazy. They're not mentally ill. They would never do that. Well, it is true that people with a severe mental illness are at greater risk of taking their lives, but don't take that to mean that only people with mental illness take their life. What happens for most suicides that I've been associated with or know about, it was a person who was under extreme duress at the time. Any other time, they were performing a normal life. They had families, they had children, they had a job. From the outside, it looked like their lives were okay, but they were under extreme stress. And that extreme stress got them to a point where they would be willing to consider their lives. One of the points that you made, I think that you made it earlier, Jason, was that usually they tell somebody. In my experience with firefighters, about 7 out of 8 times they've told somebody. But they didn't tell everybody. And
Right.
so people say, well, hey, I never heard that. My friend never said that to me. Yeah, but they may have said it to you, but maybe they said it to somebody else. So usually somebody has some inkling that there's a potential suicide. When people get to talking more openly about this, that this is something that happens, we need to prevent it, we need to intervene, well, we can prevent a lot of these suicides.
Yeah, and one kind of factoid which leans to like the prevention and talking about it more is, I think this was from Jonathan Haidt's book, which is kind of a random factoid, but talking about how like every single person that jumped off of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco that survived immediately knew it was a mistake, right? Not everybody survived, but right. So you're familiar with that as well.
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, yeah, you're under duress. You think that you have no options. And the second it's a mistake, but most people it's too late. So thank you guys again for the work you do. Absolutely.
Thank you.
I'm going to move into kind of the portion of our podcast where we talk about a positive intervention. And we use these positive interventions daily with the work that we do with our clients. We also use them with our staff in our staff meetings. And it is really to help to create optimal wellness. Dr. Powers did write a book, which we'll be sending both of you copies of. It's the
awesome
Guide. And we sent you the positive intervention for you to be able to participate. And, you know, after getting ready, and I'll read it in just a second, but I think too that there's a hopelessness that is around folks, and that sometimes a little bit more kindness and a little bit more time spent could maybe create a pathway for more conversations to happen. So today's quote is, kindness in words creates confidence. Kindness in thinking creates profoundness. Kindness in giving creates love, by Lao Tzu, which I think that sometimes kindness in giving, creating love to people who are feeling really hopeless could help take them to a different place. So what is kindness? Kindness is many things: an act of giving, a virtue in practically every culture, a pathway to changing relationships, the world, and yourself, a way to dissolve misunderstanding and judgment, a way to create unity where there might otherwise be disconnection. Giving, or kindness with legs, is better than receiving. You might think you are giving solely for the benefit of others, but that is quite rarely the case. When you give to another, you engender positive feelings about yourself, greater hope and trust in the world around you, and a valuable sense of durable fulfillment. So the positive intervention associated with that is to practice 5 acts of kindness. There's many ways to give. Pay for the person directly behind you at the toll booth or the coffee shop. Volunteer at a local shelter. Put money in random parking meters. Greet strangers with warm smiles. Use only kind words, or deliver flowers to someone special in your life. So we've asked in this positive intervention that folks do that and then journal about what you did and how you felt. Did you commit any anonymous acts of kindness? Were the feelings any different depending on who benefited from your kindness? Were smaller acts of kindness different in any way from larger ones? And how has prioritizing kindness affected your outlook on life today? So I was wondering if, Kimi, you would share a little bit about your experience with the positive intervention.
Yeah, I was actually really excited when you sent the prompt over, because it's something that it's funny. I was telling my husband this today. It's like JBK, and he was like, "What's that?" And I was like, "Just be kind." And that's something that it's, certainly something I try to do, but also something that I constantly need to work towards. And so it was really great to have this permission to focus on that in this crazy time that we live in. And I was really reflecting that there's never been a better time for random acts of kindness than this exact moment that we live in right now. If only for the fact that just focusing a little bit of your energy on someone else helps relieve some of the stress you might feel about what's going on in your world. It's and especially now we're kind of isolated, and you sometimes only see what's in your island and you don't know what's going on. Occasionally we can build that bridge, and I really was excited to work on that. So some of the things I was focusing on this week that I think, especially when you live in such close quarters and you're not seeing anyone else, is to forgive the little things. And that is something that I need to do for myself, but also for my partner, because this is a situation where none of us are experts at dealing with life like this. This is still challenging. So I was telling my dad this the other day, but I was checking out online at the grocery store so I could curbside pick up my groceries. And I thought I checked out, but I had not. And so drove to the store. No groceries were there. It's like, normally I think I would be so miffed at myself, for God, you're so stupid. How could you forget to do the thing? And in this moment, I was like, boy, COVID is tough. Whoa, like it got me that time, and having a little forgiveness for myself when I make those kind of challenges, having some forgiveness with my husband we've also been like, the whole world's upside down. Like everything that we used to do is done differently. So we've both struggled in those ways and trying to have a little grace on that subject. We take a really long walk every morning. We walk 3 miles. We have 2 giant dogs. So we walk 3 miles. Great for me, great for the baby, great for the dogs, all that stuff. And so I've sort of come to know people on the trail. And, this last week, there was a woman we've seen before. She was walking a little ways behind us. And when we turned around, she was like, "Oh, are you guys turning around?" And we're like, "Yeah." And she's like, I usually walk with my friend, but my friend's not here today. So I'm sorry. I've been kind of like keeping pace with you because I've seen you before. And I was like, well, why don't you just walk with us? And we got to meet a new person and hear about what's going on with her and how she's been dealing with all this stuff. And gosh, it was great to build a sense of community when that's like the first new person I've met in so long.
That's really great.
So I think it, in the exercise, I really reflected, as you said, like giving is great, but it's often never truly giving. And in all of those examples, I was receiving something as well. And I'm very, very, very thankful for that.
Thanks, Kimi, for doing our positive intervention. We appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Dr. Buser, what was it like for you?
Well, one of the things that occurred to me, and first of all, I really liked the idea, and I thought it was useful. It's the kind of thing that I would recommend to other people, but maybe wouldn't necessarily say, I need to do this too. And I thought, well, I need to remove that excuse. I need to do that myself. And so at first I found myself, I wanted to do something, of great magnitude. I don't know, something that was huge. And then I started thinking, well, it doesn't have to be something enormous. It just needs to be an act of kindness, an act of giving. So these are not big things, but they were meaningful for me. I called one of a guy that used to work for us, sort of a handyman. I hadn't talked to him in several years. We just hadn't utilized him, and I just was thinking about him. So I called this guy and checked on him, and I could tell he was very pleased that, to hear from me. He said, I wondered if I had offended you because you hadn't called me. And I thought, wow, I know, he didn't offend me. And I just, for some reason, he was on my mind, and I reached out to him. And it was, as Kimi was noting it, I got as much from it probably as he did, as I liked this guy. And I had no idea that he thought that we had somehow been offended by him. And so it was relieving in a way that of a guilt in a way that I didn't know I had. So it was really helpful. The other thing I did, again, it was a small thing and a kind of a silly thing, but it brought me a great deal of pleasure, and I suspect for others that I shared this with, is I happened to come across this video on YouTube. It's actually been sent to me by a friend. And the video is of a musical group playing. It's really unusual what they're playing. It's actually a group of trombones. I play trombone, or used to. And so it's a group of trombones that were playing actually the Queen song, what's
Bohemian Rhapsody.
Bohemian Rhapsody, there it is.
Yeah.
It was about 28 trombones playing Bohemian Rhapsody. It's a very unusual piece of music. And it was so beautiful and so funny and so unusual. So I sent it to all of my friends that are musicians that I've played with in the past or know about. And so then I got all these different responses. Well, I hadn't heard from you in a long time. Wow, that was so cool. Let me share something with you. And it was really contagious, that very simple thing about how much I got from that, as much as hopefully they got from it as well.
So wonderful.
Powers, what did you do that was an act of kindness?
I think that we should just end after those two perfect. Or you said.
Well, today I was being kind to someone else. And in this exact moment of being kind to someone else, I realized I was being kind to myself. So it's true. I went to a colleague's office and said, hey, I'm making some tea. Would you love a cup of tea?
A cup of?
Oh, I would love to have a cup of tea. And so it was Moroccan mint tea, which is fabulous. It's my favorite one.
Sounds good. But
in the moment when I was making it, I realized that this is something my mom always did for me. And so I was being, I took that on. My mom is here with us, not in Texas, but I'm missing her a lot because of COVID. I haven't seen her in a while, and I just must have been channeling KK. So, but now everyone's going to be asking for Moroccan mint tea. So, perfect. Anyways, thank you so much for being on the podcast. And I also am going to steal something from you, Kimi. I'm going to use the JBK as a hashtag somewhere because I love that. Just be kind. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. My pleasure. It was so wonderful to meet you both. Have a great rest of your day.
Likewise. And congratulations on the baby.
Woohoo! I know. Getting closer every day.
All right.
Thank you so much for having us.
Bye. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Dr. Buser. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Positive Recovery MD. Don't forget to visit positiverecoverymd.com to sign up to get your daily positive intervention sent straight to your inbox. Be sure to subscribe to Positive Recovery MD on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts to receive an automatic download when a new episode drops. And as always, if you or someone you know needs help, visit positiverecovery.com or call 877-4-SOBRIETY, which is 877-476-2743. We are here to help.